It's great to have a fellow San Franciscan in the room, although I suspect there's a few. Here we go. I had a feeling there'd be a few others here. I'm going to introduce my panel in a moment because it's a very distinguished group. But first, I want to take 2 seconds and just introduce the topic at hand. It's interesting in just the last day or change that I've been here. This seems to be the defining topic for Aspen and maybe even the defining topic for our age. And at the risk of hyperbole, and I've been accused of that multiple times before by my partners and oftentimes my clients, we are arguably in the midst of a disruption not dissimilar to the one where we went from hunter-gathering to agrarian to industrial, obviously with a fair bit of time passing between the first and the second and less time between the second and the third. And this disruption, you can call it the post-industrial age, you can pick your name, is arguably, again, going to be even more of a massive shift, certainly at a much faster pace than those other disruptions. And so the questions that we've posed for our panelists, and I'm hoping they will have all of the answers, are really around the nature of jobs as we look both in the moment we're in and as we look forward. What are the jobs available to us now? How are those going to change? And then as importantly, how are we going to skill and reskill our population to meet the needs of those jobs, again, both currently and in the future. And so that's the topics at hand. I'm going to very much bring the audience in, but let me take a moment and introduce my panelists. Peter Orszag to my left, and I guess I should say Dr. Peter Orszag to my left, currently is a managing partner at Lazard and the co-head of their healthcare group. But you'll know him historically through his multiple roles through, I think, 3 different presidential administrations. In the Clinton administration as an economic advisor in a couple of different roles there, then chairing the Congressional Budget Office under President Bush, and then lastly, the Office of Management and Budget under President Obama. Peter, welcome. Penny Pritzker to Peter's left has been, and I think will continue to be, a civic leader, an entrepreneur, a philanthropist, the head of both her own private equity fund and a real estate fund, but also I think in the way many of us know Secretary Pritzker is the former Secretary of Commerce in the Obama administration. And Tom Fanning is the CEO, president, and chairman of the board of the Southern Company, which I think is known to all of us as one of the largest energy companies in the United States. Tom's also, I think, on the Federal Reserve Board, the chair of the Federal Reserve Board in Atlanta, and a major civic leader and philanthropist. So we've got 3 very interesting people, 3 very different, or potentially very different points of view, depending on the topic at hand. And as I say, I'll start the questions, but then I'm really going to look, particularly given the size of this audience, I think we can make this very interactive and a group discussion. Peter, I might start with you as our resident economist. I made the initial point or the proposition that we were in the midst of this massive disruptive change. Do you agree with that perspective, and can you compare it to other disruptive changes we've had from an economic point of view?
Well, yes, I do agree. It's I think a massive change, but there are 2 caveats. One is, it is, and I think Austin Goolsbee made this point at some other panel here yesterday, it is an odd thing that we are in the midst of a massive artificial intelligence, big data, machine learning revolution, and simultaneously, U.S. productivity growth has halved from 2.25 to 1.1. Those 2 things are inconsistent with one another. So there's some tension between thinking this is the biggest thing that's ever happened and we're in the midst of it, and it not showing up in the statistics. And that brings me to my second point, which is these things often take a significant amount of time to play out. And my favorite example comes from David Otter, who's an MIT professor, who correctly noted that the number of ATMs in the United States from 100,000 to 400,000 over the past 25 years. You would think, therefore, the number of bank tellers in the United States would have plummeted. And instead, the number of bank tellers in the United States 30 years ago was about 500,000, and today it's about 500,000. And the point there is these things can often play out in unexpected ways. What happened there was, yes, the number of bank tellers per branch went down, but the number of branches went way up. And also, the bank tellers are doing different things. They are much less likely to be making cash, and they're more taking deposits, and more likely to be doing other things. So yes, it is massive, but questions about it showing up in the productivity statistics, and also questions about the timetable through which many of these effects play through.
So to follow on that last point then, Peter, then you would say we didn't get more productive in banking, but we did have a much higher level of service to the consumer. Is that how that actually plays out?
Well, one of the problems, this raises some of the measurement issues, because one of the problems in a lot of services businesses is it's very hard to measure what the output is. And so you often wind up using inputs as the proxy for output, and the productivity statistics can suffer as a result. But I do think, again, there's just this basic tension. Even if you take the most aggressive assumptions about measurement error, there still has been a slowdown in productivity growth, even being as generous as possible. And that's a sort of odd thing. And banking may be one example of that.
Tom, maybe I'll turn to you. Are you seeing this in your own business where you're seeing automation replacing people, but then people finding other needs, or are you just seeing them replacing people?
Boy, it really depends. I'll just be provocative right away. The whole world is going to this digital age and robots and this idea of resourcing manufacturing. Yeah, you know what? But they're robots. They're not people. And so there's two really kind of well-developed arguments about robotics, digital penetration, artificial intelligence will reduce kind of the workforce. There's the other argument that says, no, there's a whole brand new workforce that will emerge behind it. There's the idea and the argument about different people have different statistics about, 5% of jobs are going to straight out be eliminated because they're not going to turn wrenches. Somebody else, some robot will. But there needs to be somebody to work behind those robots to service them. And then there's the notion of hybridization. And that's the idea that your job will have to accommodate some digital aspect that didn't exist before. The nature of your job will likely change. And you'll have to learn to work collaboratively with this kind of new technology. Let me just give you something else I do. I chair for the United States all the cyber and physical kind of security terrorism work. You've heard about all these cyber attacks here recently. If you think about cyber defense in the electricity sector in the United States, it's almost like the Russian nesting dolls, where there's different layers.
Sure, that's the analogy you want to use.
Draw your own inference. Yeah. But the fail-safe line of defense in the electricity sector, it's why some books that are written are just pure garbage about this subject, is to de-link from the digital age and run systems manually. We can do that. The problem in the workforce is people that were doing that in the 50s and 60s have died or retired, and the new kids don't get it. And so there's a whole new idea behind what creates resiliency and critical infrastructure in America. And as we become more and more kind of imbued with the spirit of the power of the digital age and artificial intelligence, what are the unintended consequences? It's a fascinating path to walk down.
Penny, I know you've thought quite a bit about this topic, both not so much the resiliency in the electricity industry, but really in a sense, what's different this time around in terms of the scale and speed of this change, and what do we need to think about in terms of workers?
Is that even though productivity may not be growing as fast as we would hope, the reality for the worker in America is it's a very stressful time. That this pace of change and the nature of work is the way it's changing has created a real challenge for the average young person trying to figure out how do I get, and their parents, trying to figure out how do I get myself on a path where I'm on a career path that is sustainable. And then there's the angst of if I'm mid-career and things change. And then there's you hear from the employer side, and I didn't speak, I spoke with over 2,000 employers on different occasions about different things. Not one of them did not have a problem finding the skilled workforce that they needed. It didn't matter if they were a bicycle manufacturer, in energy production, or in the digital economy in another form or fashion. They were all struggling to find a skilled workforce. And I think one of the biggest challenges we face is actually getting our systems to line up to match up with the needs of the employers. And we're not doing it. And it needs to start basically in middle school. And we need to say, you know, here's our emerging careers, but you in 6th grade need to take X amount of math. You don't have to become a PhD in math, but in order to be able to, you know, have a certain career path, even in middle skills, and even in the challenges of how do we keep our grids safe, and maybe it becomes more analog and less digital, you need basic training. And then how do we make that cheaper and more easier for someone to navigate and build upon over time? We're not, you know, we have very few states in this country that are set up well for this.
Well, let me just jump in real quick, because we're wrestling with the notion of what is education and what is training. And this whole notion of education is I go to grammar school and I go to middle school and I go to high school and I go to college and I'm done is crazy. When you think about the big tectonic shifts we've had in industrial America, from say the steam engine to mass production to automation to now this artificial intelligence digital age, boy, it's really moving quickly. And the idea is that your job may be obviated in 10 years, or every 10 years you may need to be rethinking if you're in certain classes. And so when we think about benefits, when we think about employing people, there's got to be a continuous focus on retraining along the way so that you're never obviated from the next layer of change that may emerge.
And our federal or our state systems that support that training, or the various entities that offer such training, need to be flexible enough to acknowledge you've got to be a lifelong learner. And our systems right now are too rigid, and they don't understand, they're not responding to the system.
And here again, to be provocative, I know the federal government has an enormous role to play, but I would rather their role to play would be to invest money in the states. I think all of these job training issues are built around communities and around plants and around also creating kind of laboratories to grow and nurture small to startup companies. So,
four really quick points on this. First, there is no way we're going to make tons of progress on this without both rejiggering what we do, but also, just to be blunt, spending more on it. The United States spends 1/10 as a share of our economy relative to what the Nordic countries do, or the best in class in the OECD, on vocational training. And the fact of the matter is, we are not going to get very far if we do it on the cheap. So that's the first point.
Can I just underscore that? We spend less than every other OECD country except Mexico and Chile, and Europe spends 7 times more than we do.
let me also add one. I was Jeb Bush's on his transition team, and one of my things was education. The state of Florida is one of the best or biggest community college programs. 35% of the graduates were cosmetology. Yeah. We need to go back to this idea of let's invest in what's useful. Maybe we make it free for things that are useful in the future. Oh, wait.
And I was going to say, and look, the other thing that we need to do is on the curriculum. No one knows exactly what is going to lead to success in this new world, but the best bet is the combination of good social skills and familiarity with statistics and computer programming. We need a lot less geometry and a lot more Python and R, and also teaching how to work in teams. And those are teachable things that we are underinvesting in for middle school, high school, and on to community college.
And when you say social skills, do you mean in addition to being a good salesperson or relating to people,
no, I mean
social media, the whole new way
No, I really
to
meant working in a team. I didn't mean the ability to host a party. I meant,
No. Social media is where I was going.
Yeah, so...
See, I think the way we communicate with each other, the way that people are growing up today, our kids don't communicate the way we did.
That's definitely true.
And that is an enormous issue going forward in the workforce.
And then
you had two other points.
Really quickly, because third point is to the point about the connection between companies and what is being trained. There has been some progress in the Commerce Department and the Department of Education. Some mayors have tried to do this, but we are still way far behind where we should be in connecting local employers with local community colleges. Basically, instead of having the community colleges guess at what the curriculum should be and students not knowing where the jobs might be, the local employers should signal to the community colleges, These are the positions we need in 2 years. The community colleges should do a lot more at building up the curriculum, and the students going in know that if they do a good job, they go through that curriculum, there's a high probability of a job on the other end at those local employers. And there's been some of that, but we're not, we're like 5% of where we.
The siloization locally is a real problem, and even if a community like Houston, which when the oil and gas prices went down, basically had too many oil and gas workers, but they needed petrochemical workers. That whole city, they set a great example. That whole city came together, led by the mayor. They brought all the educational institutions together with the business community and with the social services organizations, and said, we have to have a complete program to take 100,000 workers from oil and gas into petrochemical, and we need to do it ex post, we need to do it quickly. And they really set an example of how and I agree with you, Tom, it's local. The answers are local, they are not federal. But the funding and the flexibility that comes from the federal government needs to be more easy for the local communities to use.
Yep. In the world of capitalism, it must be a developing competency on the part of companies to grow their own.
Yes. And that was actually going to be my last point, which is...
Well, that was a good point.
Yeah, there we go. If you want, the other thing is the evidence is overwhelmingly striking that there's just been this growing gap at the firm level, at the company level, in returns on invested capital, in wages. Here's one little thing that ties directly into your point. We tend to think of inequality in the United States as being the CEO earning a lot more than the typical worker at each firm. That's what the Wall Street Journal and that's what's in the media. If you actually look at the data, there have been 3 studies over the past 3 years that have examined whether wage inequality reflects within firm, that would be the CEO versus the typical worker, or between firm, that is Apple versus Applebee's. So everyone at one firm diverting from everyone at another firm. And it turns out that somewhere between 2/3 and all, in other words, the vast majority of the rise in wage inequality in the United States is between firm, not within firm. We have fundamentally mischaracterized the nature of wage inequality. And it has to do, something is happening with superstar firms and what they do, where there's been, at the frontier of productivity, there's been firms that are at the frontier have seen no slowdown in their productivity growth rate.
Or hiring.
And you're seeing this growing divergence. So one of the other pieces of advice to young people is if you see a superstar, it's the advice that Eric Schmidt gave to Sheryl Sandberg, which is if you're offered a seat on a rocket ship, get on. And that's exactly the point, because these firms seem to be doing something with regard to pretty much all their employees that is paying off in terms of wages, mobility, and it has to involve ongoing training.
So, but stay with that thought for a moment. It's ever so slightly tangent, but I think comes back to our broader topic. You compared Apple and Applebee, but what about Apple and its competitors in the industry? Because is this basically pick the right industry and make sure you're skilled for that industry?
In each industry, it's really odd if you think about it, because in this world of, instantaneous communication and the free flow of information, you would think that it would be harder for the leading firm to take on new technology or new production processes or whatever and diverge from the other firms within that sector. You'd think that the spillovers would have become easier to imitate. And what we've seen over the past 15 to 20 years instead is exactly that. Within each sector, the leading firms have just grown apart from the other firms. You see this in publicly traded firms. So McKinsey, for example, has the McKinsey valuation book is like the Bible in valuation work. And one of the key concepts is return on invested capital. If you look in that book, one of the most striking charts is what's happened to publicly traded return on invested capital. The 90th percentile versus the 10th percentile across firms looks like all of our wage inequality charts. It goes like this.
Winner takes all.
There's a winner-take-all phenomenon that we have been applying at the individual level that is instead appears to be occurring at the firm level.
Well, but it occurs, every CEO that's been successful has a reluctance to change. One of the greatest harbingers of future failure is past success. And one of the things that you do when any idiot will jump off a burning platform. That's dumb. What we have to have in terms of corporate culture and employee culture, and in terms of education culture, is the notion that you're playing a game that doesn't exist today. And you got to have the vision and courage necessary to start thinking about the options and the capabilities and the skills you need to develop before you need them. And so having this ongoing education and an ongoing realization in a corporate sense that creative destruction in terms of this pace of technology change must be occurring today. You must continually attack yourself, and from a human resource standpoint, make sure that's reflected in the education and training you provide for folks.
Well, and you could go one step further, and Penny, I think you were getting at this, which is if you believe you're going to be around in 20 years, focusing on the middle schools today actually is a benefit to your corporation going forward. And it's not just a humanitarian or a broader social purpose, it's actually critical to the corporate enterprise.
But if you think about the challenges that we're discussing here, the real question is, we need a comprehensive strategy, and we don't have it.
Yep.
We don't have it at the federal level. We don't have a playbook to offer up to states. There are some states who have been more successful and governors who've been more forward-leaning. We need to put a playbook together, and that's one of the things that we're working on, the Council on Foreign Relations. We've got a task force focused on this, and some of the task force members are even here today, to try and have that ready by the first quarter of next year to be used, not partisan, but we need for our country to be competitive. I mean, it's not just a company, it's where's the country going in terms of its competitiveness? How do we stay on the bleeding edge in some of these fields, and how do we make sure we don't lose other industries to the rest of the world because we aren't innovating, or because we aren't providing the workforce that the innovative leader needs?
And the playbook you describe is for the it's for basically how do you as a state or a municipality develop the appropriate education structure for a workforce?
Exactly. So if you took, for example, if you were to ask Governor Hickenlooper about the challenges he faced here in Colorado, he would tell you, I had to change 15 laws in order to be able to create enough flexibility so that kids weren't all being pushed to four-year college, when that isn't where our needs were not 100% everybody in four-year college. The needs of the state were broader than that. Yeah. And so this is about really getting beneath the covers and looking at how do you structure your state so that you're offering up, the career path and pathways so that someone can be constantly learning, but maybe it isn't a four-year college onto, a master's or a PhD or whatever, that there are multiple routes. Many of those jobs exist. We're short 10%. I think there's a disconnect in middle skill jobs, about 10% in the country. Another challenge we have is mobility. Getting people with those skills in the right places is a real challenge that we face. There's no strategy, and I'm not saying, like divine the solution, but at least give enough. The other issue we have is 55 million people working in the on-demand economy. Are benefits structured to support that? And that's only going to grow, and we know the answer is no. So what should we be doing at the federal level to support that fact?
But here's the thing at the federal level, and I don't mean to harp on this, but so much of government is frozen. We're red and we're blue and we're liberal and we're whatever. I think it is the obligation these days of private industry to step into the breach and force sane conversations about how to create public-private partnerships and solve these things. If we sit around and wait for a federal program, we're going to be dead. We're going to be way behind the curve. We need both. And I think it's the obligation of the private sector to step into this breach and create that conversation and really work with the federal government and state and local governments to create the right solutions.
That seems to be the common denominator, actually, which is that we're going to solve more of this at the state level and then hopefully by imitation.
Stop it at the state level with private.
You don't have a choice.
Yeah, out of necessity.
You don't have a choice.
Exactly.
I want to use that maybe as a jumping off point. As I said, I wanted this really to be a discussion with the audience and the group at large. Questions from the group for our panelists? Please, we'll start here. And there's a microphone coming down to you. And I think it's always helpful if you wouldn't mind maybe your name and where you're from or any other
Stan Pritzker, Milwaukee. I'm reasonably satisfied that government and industry is going to address the problem of training, retraining workers, and so forth. What I don't see happening is any solution coming from government, and certainly not from industry, for what I will loosely call the underclass. Take Penny Pritzker's Chicago. 50% of the incoming freshmen don't graduate. They become gangbangers or whatever, and if they come to my shop to be hired and don't have computer school skills and have a criminal record, they're not going to be hired. And I don't see government or industry or a combination addressing these problems for the underclass, who are going to really be not just left behind, but left way behind. One more just thing. In Milwaukee, when I was growing up a long time ago, if you dropped out of high school, you'd go to Holton Street and get a job at American Motors to assemble frames. Those jobs aren't there anymore. Sure. These kids are on the street. What is going to happen? Because government is failing to address the issues of this vast and growing underclass.
So we have talked about, yeah, please, Peter.
Well, look, I think there are multiple dimensions to that. One that I will mention is we need to, you mentioned criminal records. We need to do a better job for especially non-violent criminal activity, not making that a thing that imperils the rest of your life. If a kid made a mistake at 20 and had a DWI or a marijuana offense or whatever, and was arrested and has some criminal record, that should not be an impediment to employment over the next 15 or 20 years. And the evidence is strongly suggestive that we are doing this all wrong in terms of, effectively creating massive 20, 30-year penalties for them. Most people, the evidence strongly suggests that the probability of being caught for a crime is much, much more effective than the impact if you're caught, because when you're in the moment of a criminal activity, you're not thinking about 20 years away. We need to do more on detection and less on these 20 or 30-year kind of long-term harm or penalties. That's one thing. There's a whole larger agenda that is obviously directly relevant to our politics and to our economy, involving how to, frankly, rescue or how to provide assistance here. And I'll just give you one statistic, which is you don't need to get to the economics of it or wage growth or even unemployment. In this country, in the world's leading economy, something like 30 to 40% of the US population is experiencing either a decline or at best flat life expectancy. Just think about that for a second. A significant share of the US is experiencing basically no improvement in life expectancy, and it's
That'd be for the first time in our history.
that is for, well, I mean, there were, way, way back, but first time in modern history.
Modern history.
That anything close to that kind of share. And it reflects a whole variety of forces, not all of which are easy to solve, but this is, I agree with you, a first order issue that is affecting not only the people themselves, but frankly, our politics as a whole, because if you've got 40% of the population whose life expectancy is going down, it's not surprising they're very, very unhappy.
I would offer 3 ideas to, as a principle, what we have to do as CEOs, business leaders, is to play offense relentlessly everywhere we can on these issues. In other words, I can't just rely on the education system to, deliver these kids to my doorstep. So we are intervening on and funding on the agendas of all the schools we touch, starting with elementary, moving through high school. So we actually participate in curriculum development. Number 2 would be, we now do public-private partnerships, particularly in the skills area. So in the Panhandle of Florida, we have Gulf Power Academy, and we're building the first nuclear plant in a generation of Americans. We work with Augusta Tech. And we fund programs to train people that will come out and be productive in our workforce. And then thirdly, which is also kind of interesting, we participate directly with people like the building trades. I would argue a great leader in America is Sean McGarvey, who's the president of America's Building Trades. And understanding kind of in a very strategic way what skills we need, when we'll need them, and then working with covered workers to develop training programs, facilities, and pipelines of resources are kind of three ways to maybe help.
Just a few reasons to be both optimistic, but also to areas that require focus. If you look at today, Arnie Duncan's working with our highest shooters, the people who are the most likely to either shoot or be shot in the South Side. And they'll tell you that for $13 to $15 an hour, they're happy to give up being on the street doing what they're doing. So it's not as though their goals and lifestyle is out of reach. The second issue is bias in training. One of the challenges that we have to face is to make sure that in selecting people to go through training, that we deal with bias. And that's an area of increased focus, where you can now technologically, question for or test for team skills or social skills or some of the things that you were talking about, Peter, and be, let's call it gender blind, ethnicity blind, religious blind, and then therefore produce a group for training that is more diverse so that we can offer greater opportunities. The third is we have to ultimately produce more jobs in these communities so that these folks who are, and I'll use the South Side, which you focused on, so these folks have an opportunity actually to get on the conveyor belt moving upward and get out of those communities. What's happening is we are losing population there in our toughest communities. Basically, anybody who can get out is leaving. And what we have to do is offer an opportunity for those folks to be able to stay and actually have a family. It needs to be safe, but there also need to be job opportunities for folks.
I'm going to take your comment one step further. Diversity Inc. gave, they ranked the top 50 diversity companies in America. They gave us the #1 category, created a new category, and it really dealt with what do you do with people once they come in. And this notion of being race or gender blind, and I'm with you, but it isn't enough, because you could be race or gender blind and bring people in, and then they all have to fit in. And what you do in football, we're getting near football season, thank God, is the idea, like Georgia Tech runs the ball all the time. You want to stop Georgia Tech, you take away the run and make them throw the ball. You make them play, the quote is left-handed. What we have to do inside companies these days, which will also help address this problem, is increase our cultural bandwidth. So when we think about diversity, it isn't diversity of race and gender. That's where everybody goes to, because those are kind of legal concepts and they're easy to see. But we got to go to the notion of the value of diversity. It's not just race, gender, it's religion and sexual orientation and age and ethnicity and blah, blah, blah. That we have all these wonderful facets of differences. And what we got to do is create an environment inside our institutions where people can come and play with all they got. Now, everybody has to fit in a little bit, but bringing your whole self to work does a lot of things. Number one, you're much more productive. But number two, we keep talking about the pace of change and technology and how that's changing everything. If you increase your cultural bandwidth in the most robust sense that I'm describing, what you really do is build an institutional capability of increased vision and courage. Instead of seeing through a tiny little knothole, you're able to have a much better sense of context, of judgment, of skills that don't exist inside a very kind of vanilla place. And so that's something else that we've got to think about in terms of the workforce of the future.
Sure. And the company of the future. Please.
All right, Bob.
It's coming.
My name is Robert Potter. I come from Dallas, and I want to offer number 4 to Tom's list, and that is hire interns, summer students.
Absolutely.
And give students at all levels a chance to work part-time in the companies of their environment. That will allow half-educated, half-trained people be more educated, more trained, and it provides a interview in depth for the employer.
Bob, you ought to be on stage. You're exactly right.
Thank you.
Bob, on that, I've been stunned by, I come from not far from the Valley, the number of startups that might have 20 people but have 10 summer interns.
Absolutely.
It's a very different equation they're using to think about people for a period of time and buying their, because they're assuming they're going to be bigger.
And you want to know something that I think is so smart in what you said. You can educate and you can train. There's nothing like experience. When my kids were going through, I said, go work somewhere for free. Just get the experience. Now, we're able to do that because my kids are well off. Right? But what if they need a job for money? So companies have to meet them halfway there.
Please. Microphone's coming from behind.
I'm Alan Bushin from Chicago, and I'm the chairman and part founder of 20 charter schools in the south side of Chicago and the west side. And I want to thank Penny publicly for being one of our biggest supporters. But in any event, the difference in results for graduating college in 6 years from our schools and the public schools is just amazingly shocking. We graduate between 37 and 45% of our kids. They come from the same neighborhoods. They don't have to test to get in. They just have to choose to go to have the right to choose. And we're graduating that, and we think we'll get to 50% in a few years as we're going. The rest of the Chicago public high schools are in the same areas, same students. They come from the same families. They're going to college. I've heard numbers of graduating college, 10%, 15%. Dramatic differences. Now, what are the differences? The differences is basically the Chicago Teachers Union. Chicago Teachers Union, we have 20 schools, which is, I think, the biggest group of high schools in the country. We can't expand because the politics in Chicago won't give us schools unless the aldermen approve it, and the aldermen are bought and paid for by the union. I don't have a solution to any of this, but there is a solution to the problem if we can figure out how to get around the politics.
Please, Peter.
I guess I would just say, look, it's really interesting. The evidence on successful charter schools, which it has been building, Roland Fryer has identified 4 or 5 key factors that lead to, because it's not always the case that even charter schools are universally successful. Some are good, some don't succeed quite to the same degree. And the question then becomes, can you take the defining characteristics that characterize the charter schools that do well and export that to a public school system, which is what they're trying to do in Houston. So it involves things like time at task, data-driven matching of teachers and students, setting expectations, all of which may come back to, time at task right there, you do run into problems as you've run into in Chicago in extending the school day and extending the school year. But the evidence suggests that it matters, that the more time that kids spend on task, the better they do.
I saw you shaking your head, so
Well,
you got to say something.
Maybe I have too much knowledge. Having both served on the school board and having been very involved in the Noble Street Charter Schools, which Alan is the chairman of the board and has done an extraordinary job, along with the CEO, of building a set of schools where, of the non-selective enrollment schools in Chicago, the top, I think 9 of the top 10 are Noble Street schools. So, on every dimension, these schools are way outperforming our public counterparts. And it is more than time on task. It starts with the minute you show up there. The discipline in the organization, the commitment to college it's every day, 24/7, and it permeates not just the school, but also the family engagement. And it goes on and on and on, and it's just a completely different culture. And it's also the flexibility that the teachers have within the charter system, the Noble system, versus the average public school. It's just, it goes to work rules and all these other things. You just can't say, oh, well, I'm going to take a few of the aspects of one and port it over to the other, and you can change those cultures. They're very, very, very different. I think that where we did a bad job as charter school, and we tried to change this and couldn't. We were in Chicago, we had a huge experiment with charter schools. And the truth is, a third of them are much better than our public schools. A third are just the same, and a third are worse. And we didn't close the bad ones. And then by the time we decided to start closing the bad ones, it had become way too political, and you couldn't even get the bad ones closed. And so then it really tarnished the whole charter movement, and it gave the unions the opportunity to say, look, they're no better, and why are we spending public money here versus there, even though the data is unquestionably different. And
On the best.
On the best in quality, on the top third, the data is unquestionably different, and you have these waiting lists of people who recognize that, who want their kids to go there because they realize this is, an opportunity for them. And it's not to say there aren't publicly run schools that do as good a job. It's just not the whole system.
I think we've got one back here. Hand up.
Thank you. My name's Win Churchill. I'm from Philadelphia. My wife and I have charter schools that we founded in 4 cities, Philadelphia, Trenton, Washington, D.C., and Memphis. And just a kind of a note of optimism, one of the schools that we founded in Washington is a different model. It's called a contract school. These were under the days of Michelle Rhee. And when we were asked to consider doing this contract school, we said essentially it's all about the work rules. We're not going to do this unless we can establish our own set of work rules. So this was kind of a tripartite negotiation between ourselves, the school district, and the union, where we established what amounted to workable work rules, if you will, with the union's kind of approval. Going back to Philadelphia, we have not had that experience, so I want to echo or really agree with what the gentleman said about Chicago. So we have a lot of these kinds of problems, but perhaps this contract school model could be replicated in other places where you have perfectly good people who are members of the union, lots of good teachers and so forth and so on, but you have this political sort of blockage.
And I'm on the board at New Visions in New York, and it's exactly the same thing. So I don't want to overstate the case, but I do think, look, here's the other problem. You can get lots of examples of outstanding charter schools that are really being driven by a charismatic, crucial, either leader or principal or a few really skilled people. That is not fully scalable because you can't get enough of those people to run our entire school system. So we better hope that there are some lessons that we can learn from the top performers that we can port over into other settings, or we're not going to get to where we want to be.
We've got a question here, and the lady in the middle.
Hi, my name is Madeline Levine. I'm from San Francisco. The phrase lifelong learning has come up in so many of these sessions. And what I'm curious about is, one, its definition, because my experience in speaking with parents is their greatest concern is about metric-based learning, not lifelong learning. So the old paradigm of great grades and best colleges is still what most parents see as the most valuable thing for their kids. So do you see these as curriculum issues or as cultural change, or who's going to drive this shift from the idea of success being metric-based to a broader idea of what learning is and engagement?
Well, I'll actually add a little to that question, which is that the right juxtaposition? Because I could argue that even with lifelong learning, you could have metrics, and we see this with some corporations doing this now, where they're using the ongoing learning on the job to get certified, essentially to get badges for additional skills that then can be ported over to across companies. So maybe I'll open that up to the group in that broadest sense.
Yeah, we actually use a concept like that, like in our generation division, people that make electricity, they have something called a playbook. And there's certain expectations as to skills, capabilities, and experience, going back to Bob's point. And we have the concept even for succession planning, even up to my job. So it's pretty public at Southern. There's 5 potential successors to replace me. What we look for in those people, and we actually measure this and all that, but not only do we measure psychological kind of hows as well as whats, but we have the funny concept of merit badges. In other words, you get through finance, you get through marketing, you get through external. And so these concepts get driven all the way down. In fact, in the audience today, we have some of our high potential talent. What we do is reach way down in the organization, and we say, you know what? We're going to give these guys special opportunities because they've earned it through some metric. And here they are. There's James right there, and we got some others around. It's exciting stuff.
Others, I mean, perspective on the, again, I get to this notion of one, is lifelong learning a quest for knowledge, or is it actually tied to this, career, that there's a purpose to it in the moment, using metrics maybe as a proxy for measuring success against that purpose?
Well, I think if you really think about anyone's career, you've got to have, there's an evolution of the skills that we've all obtained, all of us sitting up here, to be able to do the current jobs that we have. And the question is, for the average person who's not on some, high achieving trend or track within a corporation, what's being offered to the average person within the corporation? And that's where companies like the Southern Company are doing, and frankly, I would argue your rocket ship companies are forcing people to constantly be acquiring new capabilities to adapt to the landscape, the competitive landscape that they're facing, so that they can actually do their jobs. We just need to make that, where someone can come in and port into that capability. And so, for example, I think one of the great things that was done, for example, in Delaware is you could go to high school. I think there are only 30 high schools in Delaware, and 15 of which you can absolutely take courses at the community college for free that give you...
while you're in high school.
While you're in high school, that allow you to accumulate capabilities, that give you certifications, that make you absolutely employable at the end of high school into advanced manufacturing. Now, are you at the most senior level? No. But can you move in, and then you can add certificates on top and begin to accumulate, and that credit that you've gotten in high school counts towards your associate's degree, which can eventually count towards your bachelor's degree over time. That becomes an extremely efficient way for someone to go from, I'm in high school and I don't see a four-year college as a path for me now, but I want to be employable, and I want to continue to improve myself. That's just one. In manufacturing, we're heading towards a shortage of. We've got 3.4 million retirements in manufacturing and 2 million openings that are probably not going to be able to be filled in this country, even though we're complaining that we want to be manufacturing more. I mean, so this is, the practical realities of going on in different states, whether it's Rhode Island, Delaware, here in Colorado, what's going on in South Carolina. I mean, there's some really innovative states that have really made it easier for people to continue their learning, but also to get in on the ground floor.
Yeah, and let me append that real quick. Boy, it's not just the what's, it's the hows. The what's are the job skills you're trying to learn, be an engineer or be a computer person or whatever it is. The hows are just as important, potentially more powerful, and that's how we act with each other. It's how we take responsibility for our teammates, responsibility for customers, responsibility for what we call the enterprise. The enterprise is something bigger than ourselves, bigger than your own bottom line. It's not your family, it's the community. It's not your workforce inside the company, it's the industry, it's the economy of America. How do we project our own personal power beyond the four corners of a job description? We look for that and evaluate that in our assessment of personnel, and that goes into our metrics, what's and how's.
I was just going to say, as someone who's started about 50 or 75 Coursera courses and finished 0, I'm partially hoping that lifelong learning does not necessarily have to be entirely merit-based. Or off of that. I really think it depends on what the goal is. And that term encompasses so much stuff that it's not specific. If you want to have the skills applicable in a job setting, I think the harder, the kind of more even frankly test-based it is, the better it is. We see this at Lazard. It's one thing to have kind of gone through a course. It's another thing if you're running the model yourself and you're responsible for it, you learn in a completely different way. And we can't avoid that process, which might be a little bit more painful, of owning the results and effectively being tested at some point. So I think there's a spectrum. I'm taking Coursera courses on things I find interesting that aren't kind of key to my job or my life, and therefore when I drop out after 2 lectures, it's okay. At the other end of the spectrum, if you are retraining for a specific job skill, it's got to be harder, basically.
But you know what's fun about that, retraining for a job skill in the emerging future? Is Chris Womack here? He was here a second ago. Anyway, he's my head of external, and which includes communications and all that. It was so funny. He was giving me a briefing on social media. Well, that was like 2 pigs looking at a wristwatch, right? And we had no idea. And so a lot of this
Too bad
notion,
Chris isn't here to defend himself.
oh, no, we say it to each other all the time. A top-down directive, you must learn this. There's a whole segment of society that knows stuff that, believe it or not, we don't. And what we've got to do is engage those people to understand these are the new trends. This is the way it's going. We can't be top-down. We've got to be collaborative in how we think about continual improvement in terms of education and training.
I'll take a question from the front here. I promised to come over to here. I know I'm biased this way. Not by design, thank you. All right, I'm going to let Penny pick the next person.
Hey, I'm Ry Finnegan from Denver. Astro Teller from Google X started off at our first session talking about how the future jobs we don't even have names for them. We're not even sure what those will look like yet. And things are evolving quickly, and we've heard a lot of great conversation around what sorts of skills we can aim towards and learn as we move towards that future. But I'd be curious from you all to get your thoughts on what the future workplace looks like and how companies are evolving to match the gig economy and how millennials are moving more frequently between jobs and past generations. So just curious kind of broadly what some of your thoughts are about not just the employees themselves, but the future of businesses as they adapt.
Question.
I'll take a shot at it. I'll at least take an element of what you said. Look, these disruptive periods look like sine waves to me. And what we're in, I think one of the reasons why we have a lack of productivity is you have this downward pressure on the sine wave that says for all the technology advancement, you have people checking out of the workforce, or you have too much regulation for good reason or bad, or whatever. And then you have inside a sine wave, another sine wave. And that's where I go with the gig economy. See, I think that's fascinating. We can use automotive as a great example. So right now, largely because of a variety of regulations or an opportunity in an economic segment, we see people taking greater capacity utilization of their own personal vehicle and making money. Good for them. But you know what? One day, Google and Lyft, not Google and Lyft, who am I saying? Uber and Lyft are going to be manned by driverless vehicles. And they'll all be electric. Isn't that cool? And maybe one day the idea of owning a vehicle will be completely passé, or it'll be kind of cute, or it'll be that people will, how much do you use your car? We were laughing about that today. I bet I use my car 5% of the time it's there, maybe 3%. And so the idea of greater capacity utilization may completely transform out what looks right now like a really cool gig opportunity into something that's very quickly outmoded in the next 5 years. Uber may be obsolete. And so we've really kind of got to always think about, and this is the way I come from a finance background, options-based theories. There is no way I can sit here and tell you what the future is. Big fan of math. I'm a chaos theory guy. And one of the things you learn about chaos theory is that the variance in nature is way bigger than we ever measure. And when you recognize the notion of potential outcomes, we always try to stress test things, and here's the expected value, and here's the 90% confidence interval. But you know what? It could be something that we don't even know. In storage technologies, lithium-ion batteries will be outmoded by some material science development we haven't figured out today, but somebody will. And so the idea is to create options, and that's kind of the advice I give people in their careers. Experience, skills, relationships. Build as many avenues, as many options as possible. And what do we say about options? Every option has value, even if it's out of the money today. So create as many options as you can, and be ready when the change occurs, and always have your eyes open.
I think you're talking partially around a question of physical configuration, if I understand, if just what's the physical workspace going to look like? Or did I misunderstand your question?
Take it in any direction. I think broadly just how is work evolving from the employer standpoint?
Got it.
Well, here's one point I would make, which is for all the talk about decentralization, mobility, couple statistics. First, job mobility and regional mobility, this comes back to Penny's point, is actually down, not up. Yeah. So you hear all about millennials moving jobs. If you look in the data, it's not actually true that people are switching jobs more frequently than in the past. So there's a little bit of a kind of, and people are definitely moving across state boundaries much less frequently than they have historically. You also hear about, the gig economy and decentralized. Well, the fact of the matter is the average size, the probability you work at a large firm is going up. Big firms, the optimal size of the firm basically has been increasing, not decreasing. And so and that makes total sense if you think that technology allows you to manage a larger organization in a more effective way than was historically, if you think there are increasing returns to scale with regard to data assets that have to be part of the same firm, and so on and so forth. So I sort of come back to the rocket ship point, which is I don't know exactly what the rocket ships are going to look like, but if I were giving advice to someone graduating from college today, it would be if one of those firms that looks like they've got their act together offers you a job, that's where you're going to get the best combination of context, experience, and sort of the feedback loop getting revved up in a positive way, and take that opportunity almost regardless of what the job is.
And with that regard to pay.
And
almost
you
without
can
regard
afford
to
it
pay.
without regard to pay, yes.
I promised I would take one more question from here, but given the feedback I've received, I wonder if you could let the lady on your right actually ask the question. No, I was teasing. Whoever's got the question.
I paid for that.
I think you can overcome your left-right bias. I'm confident of that. I have an observation and I have a question.
Please.
I'm Doug Kahn from Raleigh, North Carolina. It's my wife, Stephanie. I'll give it to you in a sec. So the observation is, Peter mentioned that the Nordic countries are spending, much more than we are in vocational training. I would observe that the great debate that's taking place the last several months about healthcare, that we spend 18% of GDP. The rest of the developed world spends half that, and we could spend a lot more in education if we address the real issue, which is wild overspending in that sector. The question goes back to what Penny was talking about, and the topic of the seminars is about the mismatch between skills and job openings. And what are skills? What are the skill sets that Tom had mentioned? That the traditional school system, it maybe at this point in our history is not hitting on. What are the skills that are needed out there that we're not training our kids for? You want to add anything? No. Sorry about that.
I've got some partial answers to that.
Well, I mean, look, it's clear that if you believe that robotics, artificial intelligence, all that's coming, who are the people behind them? And that doesn't require a 4-year degree. When you think about SQL programmers, when you think about people that maintenance desktops or servers, or the mechanics behind what drives robots. I mean, so the whole STEM issue is something that I think is really important. I mean, I thought it was a wonderful idea when I was doing the Jeb Bush thing, but it got shot down. But, I would love, kids are getting out of high school, out of college today, or even with 2-year degrees, where they don't really have marketable degrees and they're burdened with enormous debt. Somehow there ought to be incentives placed, and I would do this at the community level, to be honest with you, or at a state level, to create incentives to get folks educated or trained where their jobs are or will be, and have the public-private partnership participate in that. That's what I would do.
I'm going to give you, I mean, there are, some specific answers of we need more welders in Louisiana.
Yeah, sure.
They're very specific to particular trades. But one of the things that we found in our work with helping youth unemployment, and I think is borne out by some earlier conversations I've had with people, probably the largest single skill is this notion of character. And it represents itself in showing up on time, dressed the way you're supposed to be dressed for a piece of work without any drugs in your system. And if you talk to a number of employers, the biggest issue they're running into is people failing the drug test, that are actually skilled for the job but then fail the drug test. And as we've done this in multiple cities around the world, there are just a set of character attributes that are quite critical to success, and our schools can play a role in teaching them. We as parents can play a role in teaching them. We need to, I think, as a society, say that that's actually critical.
It's a how, not a what.
It's a how, not a what.
But if you look comprehensively and say, we need to have our young people embrace technology more and earlier. They need to also be comfortable constantly upgrading their capability. We're calling that lifelong learning. Entrepreneurial skills, even in the context of a larger company, are really critical, because just because you're big doesn't mean you're actually responding to the challenges. And then we've talked about this issue of the soft skills, the ability to work in teams, the ability to accept and receive feedback and take it in and improve oneself. And I think that you've heard an enormous plea for businesses can play the leadership role in helping to define the direction locally of where the greatest emphasis needs to be. Because what you need in Dalton, Georgia, the carpet capital of the United States, if not the world, and what you need in Houston, Texas, in terms of specific skills are different.
Yep.
And I think we've also heard there's a role for greater government assistance. And what's happening is we have a declining number of apprenticeships available in this country, not increasing at a time when absolutely we know that experience at work is a highly predictive indicator of success in not only getting a job, but in future work. And so the other thing is we only have 40% of our schools today that require you to take coding. That seems ridiculous to me in a world where we know that these are going to be basic skills. And today, last week I was in the Silicon Valley, and the CEO of LinkedIn said to me, computer science degree today is no longer sufficient. You actually need a greater capability than a general computer science degree to do coding for them. And I'm like, oh my God, this is how things are evolving. So there's a lot that we can do. It's not that complicated, but it requires breaking down silos locally and really being serious about we're going to help our young people and help those who are transferring in, and realize that this is an ongoing project, not a one-time fix.
I got to tell you something funny, though. Your notion about entrepreneurs inside institutions, 100% spot on. But you know what big companies want to do, particularly successful big companies? Imagine a Venn diagram where the 100% is all the people in the company. And there's this little slice of revolutionaries inside every company. And what they always want to do is creative destruction. They always say, why don't we do it that way? Why don't we try this? And these guys say back to them, the 90% will say, shut up, I've been so successful, look at my bonus last year. And somehow what we have to do as institutions, this goes back to your cultural bandwidth argument, would be we've got to nurture the revolutionaries.
The last
Penny, I apologize. I'm getting a very
Zero
strong
minutes.
feedback.
But can I just leave people with one concept?
Please.
Today's,
Otherwise, I can start playing the mood music.
today's student debt is greater than credit card debt.
Yeah.
So we have got to deal with the fact that we are layering on this enormous burden on people that is not sustainable in order to become a lifelong learner.
Let me thank you all, and I know we went a little bit over. I'll apologize. It gives, I think, a testimony to the richness of the discussion.